Welcome to Horrific Stories. Today's tale is a terrifying journey filled with suspense and chilling twists. If you love horror, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling tales. The open road had always been a place of freedom for long-haul truck driver Eddie Malone. He'd been driving since he was 22, now nearly 50, with countless miles, stories, and nights alone, with only the hum of his rig and the stretch of highway to keep him company. But there was one stretch of road he never liked. Highway 73, slicing through the middle of Kansas. That stretch was infamous among truckers, known for strange sightings, disappearing cars, and, worst of all, phantom truckers who haunted it. It was a cold, wet night in October. Eddie's latest job had him heading down Highway 73 to make a last-minute delivery. He wanted to avoid it, but he had little choice. The company gave him no option if he wanted his paycheck on time. And so, after dusk, he set off, his headlights piercing through sheets of rain as he settled into the familiar rhythm of the road. 2 hours in, Eddie started feeling the familiar chill that came every time he drove Highway 73. Something was off, even more than usual. The rain fell harder, making the road shine like black glass, and mist clung to the landscape like it was hiding something. Eddie noticed his radio, usually crackling with a faint hiss or occasional chatter, had gone completely silent. He fiddled with the dial, trying to pick up anything, music, weather, even static. But the silence was unsettling, like the radio didn't want him to hear something. Suddenly, a faint shape appeared in his side mirror. Eddie squinted, trying to see through the raindrops on his mirror. At first, it looked like a wisp of fog, but then it materialized. A semi-truck, just like his, rolling along a few feet behind him. Its headlights were off, the cab lights dim and ominous. Eddie's heart skipped a beat. There were only a handful of other truckers out tonight, and he hadn't seen another vehicle for miles. Thinking it might be a fellow trucker in need, Eddie slowed, signaling for the other truck to pass. But instead, the truck matched his speed, hanging just behind him, its headlights still off. Eddie felt a prickling sensation at the back of his neck and forced himself to look forward. The truck in the mirror was still there, a hulking shape cloaked in shadows, its outline hazy in the rain. Eddie felt his stomach twist as he remembered stories he'd heard from other drivers, stories he'd always dismissed as superstition. There were tales about ghost trucks that haunted Highway 73, stories about trucks appearing out of nowhere, following drivers late into the night before vanishing just as quickly. The legend went that these ghost trucks belonged to drivers who disappeared on the road, drivers who hadn't made it to their destinations. A sudden screeching filled the cabin. Eddie slammed his foot on the brakes, and his truck skidded as the tires fought for traction on the slick road. The noise hadn't come from his truck. It sounded like metal scraping against metal, like the groan of an engine giving up. The sound echoed through the dark, seeming to come from all directions. He glanced in his mirror, expecting to see the phantom truck right on his tail, but it was gone. For a brief moment, Eddie thought he was alone again. He took a deep breath, wiping his sweaty palms on his jeans, but the sense of relief was short-lived. Just as he was about to continue down the highway, a flash of white appeared on the side of the road, just up ahead. It was a figure, standing on the shoulder, drenched in rain, their face obscured by shadows. Eddie slowed, squinting to see who it was. They looked like they were dressed in some kind of uniform, but it was old-fashioned, outdated by several decades. The figure raised an arm, motioning for Eddie to stop. Against his better judgment, Eddie pulled his rig to a stop, rolling down the passenger window just enough to hear over the rain. "Need help?" Eddie called out. The figure said nothing, just stared at him with hollow eyes, water dripping down their face. They raised a hand, pointing up the road. Eddie followed the gesture, squinting to see through the downpour. For a moment, he saw nothing but rain-soaked pavement. But then he spotted it. A car, flipped on its side, wreckage strewn across the road. He cursed, grabbing his flashlight. But when he looked back at the figure to thank them, they were gone. There was no sign of anyone, no tracks in the mud along the road. Shaken, Eddie approached the wreck cautiously. The car looked like it had been there for a while, its roof crumpled, windows shattered. Rain pooled inside the vehicle, and in the dim light of his flashlight, Eddie could make out two figures in the front seat, motionless, eyes open, staring. A cold sweat broke out across Eddie's forehead. He staggered back, bile rising in his throat. The figures were slumped forward, their faces pale, frozen in expressions of terror. But as he looked closer, something caught his attention. The driver's hand clutched a CB radio mic, and Eddie could almost imagine he'd been trying to call for help. The radio in his own truck crackled to life, cutting through the silence. Eddie froze, his heart pounding as a voice came through, thin and crackling with static. "Eddie! Eddie, can you hear me?" He recognized the voice. It was his old friend Jack, another trucker who'd disappeared years ago on Highway 73. No one had ever found Jack, and Eddie had assumed he'd just skipped town. But now, hearing his voice, Eddie felt a deep, bone-chilling terror. The voice sounded faint, as if calling from a great distance, but the desperation in Jack's tone was unmistakable. "Jack?" Eddie stammered, his voice barely more than a whisper. Is that you?" "Eddie, you have to get out of here," Jack's voice rasped, each word distorted with static. "They're coming for you, Eddie. They never let us leave." A sound like nails scraping against metal filled the air, and Eddie's headlights flickered. In the rearview mirror, the phantom truck was back, closer than ever, its lights off, but the dark cab somehow filled with shadows that seemed to shift and move. He could feel it pressing down on him, a weight that made it hard to breathe. Panic surged through him as he jumped back into his cab, hands shaking as he fired up the engine. As he pulled away from the wreck, he saw movement in his rearview mirror. The two figures in the wrecked car were watching him, their heads turned impossibly toward his truck, their eyes blank, but somehow alive. Eddie floored the accelerator, his heart pounding as he sped down the highway. But no matter how fast he went, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. Every so often, he'd catch a glimpse of the phantom truck lurking just out of sight, its dark outline shifting in the shadows. When he finally reached the next town, Eddie pulled over, stumbling out of his rig and into the gas station parking lot. The clerk gave him a strange look as he staggered inside, his face pale, hands shaking. "Highway 73?" the clerk asked, a knowing look in his eyes. Eddie nodded, too shaken to speak. The clerk sighed, handing him a cup of coffee. "You're not the first, you know," the clerk said quietly. "That highway's been cursed for years. People go missing, trucks vanish, and sometimes they come back, but not in the way you'd expect." Eddie never drove Highway 73 again. But every so often, he'd hear stories from other truckers about strange sightings, of phantom trucks that followed them through the night. And each time he heard those stories, Eddie would feel a cold chill, remembering the hollow faces in the wrecked car and the voice of his old friend warning him to get out while he still could. To this day, drivers on Highway 73 report seeing Eddie's truck speeding down the road late at night, headlights dim, the figure in the driver's seat just a shadow, eternally fleeing from something no one else can see. Dale Anders was no stranger to the dark, lonely roads of the American Southwest. Driving his rig for nearly 3 decades, he'd seen it all. Drunks stumbling into the road, late-night encounters with wild animals, strange lights in the desert. But the story that changed him, the story he'd only ever whispered about, happened on a deserted stretch of Arizona's Route 94, under a blood-red moon. It was the night before Halloween, and Dale had been assigned a last-minute delivery to California. He wasn't thrilled. He'd hoped to spend Halloween with his kids, taking them trick-or-treating. But the pay was too good to pass up, and so he loaded his rig and hit the road as the sun set, his truck casting a long shadow over the barren landscape. As he drove, Dale noticed the strange color of the moon, low on the horizon, and a deep, dark red. He'd heard of blood moons before, but this one was different. It was larger, more ominous, seeming to hang just above the ground, casting an eerie crimson glow across the landscape. 2 hours in, Dale began to feel uneasy. His CB radio, usually filled with chatter from other drivers, had been silent for miles. He fiddled with the dial, trying to pick up a station, but all he got was static. Even his GPS seemed to be glitching, showing his truck moving through empty space rather than on Route 94. With a frustrated sigh, Dale focused on the road, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. Suddenly, he saw a figure standing on the shoulder up ahead, silhouetted by his headlights. It was a man, standing stiffly, his back turned toward Dale. As he got closer, Dale could see the man's clothing was torn and dirty, his head slightly tilted to one side, as if listening for something. Dale slowed down, rolling his window down just enough to call out. "You all right there?" Dale shouted, his voice lost in the roar of his engine. The man didn't turn. Instead, he raised his arm, slowly, and pointed down the road. Dale squinted, following the direction of the man's finger, but all he saw was darkness stretching out endlessly ahead. "Listen, buddy, you need a ride or what?" Dale tried again, but the man remained silent, his finger pointed down the empty road. Feeling a strange compulsion, Dale pressed on, leaving the man behind. As he passed, he felt a shiver creep up his spine, like he'd just brushed against something cold and ancient. In his rearview mirror, the man was gone. An hour later, Dale's headlights caught another figure on the road. A woman this time, standing in the middle of the lane, her hair matted and hanging over her face. Dale slammed on the brakes, his rig screeching to a stop just inches from her. She didn't flinch, didn't move. She just stood there, her face obscured, her arms hanging limply at her sides. Dale felt a chill settle in his chest as he rolled down his window. "Hey! What are you doing out here?" The woman didn't respond. Slowly, she lifted her head, and Dale caught a glimpse of her face in the headlights. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were wide and unblinking, like she was frozen in a scream. But what unsettled Dale the most was her mouth. It was twisted into an unnatural smile, her teeth bared in a grimace that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. Before Dale could react, the woman stepped forward, reaching out with one hand, her fingers long and thin, like claws. Dale's instincts kicked in, and he floored the accelerator, his truck lurching forward as he sped past her. He glanced in his mirror, expecting to see her standing in the road, but she was gone, vanished into the night. His heart racing, Dale pressed on, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He tried to shake off the encounter, convincing himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But the sense of unease only grew as he continued down the dark, empty road, the blood moon hanging low in the sky, casting its eerie glow over everything. Then his headlights illuminated a third figure standing in the middle of the road. A child, no more than 10 years old, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, staring up at him with wide, empty eyes. Dale's foot hovered over the brake, but something in him refused to stop. His mind screamed at him to keep going, to not look back. As he passed the child, he felt a wave of cold wash over him, a feeling of absolute dread, like he'd just driven through a grave. Moments later, the CB radio crackled to life, and Dale jumped at the sound. He grabbed the mic, relief flooding through him at the thought of hearing another voice. "Dale, can you hear me?" The voice on the other end was faint, distorted, barely more than a whisper. It was a voice he recognized instantly. It was his own voice. This isn't right," the voice continued, growing weaker with each word. "Turn back, Dale. They're waiting for you." Dale's hands shook as he dropped the mic, staring at it as if it had come to life. The voice repeated itself, fading in and out, each word more desperate than the last. He could feel something creeping closer, a presence in the cab with him, watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. Finally, He saw lights up ahead, the glow of a gas station breaking through the darkness. Dale pulled in, his hands trembling as he parked his rig and stumbled out into the cold night air. The station was deserted, but he didn't care. He needed to get away from the truck, from whatever had followed him down that cursed road. Inside, the station attendant looked up, giving Dale a strange look. "Rough night?" the attendant asked, his voice filled with a knowing tone. Dale nodded, too shaken to respond. "You're not the first, you know," the attendant continued, his voice low. "This stretch of road, under a blood moon, it's cursed. Folks who die out there, they don't rest easy. They wait, hoping someone will come along and take their place." Dale's heart pounded as the attendant continued, his words chilling in their simplicity. "Next time you're out there, don't stop. Don't talk to them. And whatever you do, don't look back." That night, Dale drove off Route 94, taking a different path, his eyes fixed straight ahead. But even now, years later, he still dreams of that blood moon, of the figures standing by the side of the road, waiting for him to take a wrong turn. And sometimes, late at night, when he's alone on the road, he'll catch a glimpse of them in his rearview mirror, shadows that disappear as quickly as they appear. But deep down, Dale knows the truth. They're still waiting for him. They call it Dead Man's Pass, the stretch of highway in the Rockies where even the most experienced truckers grow tense behind the wheel. Rumor has it that it's a cursed path, haunted by the spirits of those who went over the edge on the steep curves and narrow ledges. But for John J.T. Turner, the legend became all too real one icy November night. J.T. was a seasoned trucker, with years of hauling goods through mountains, deserts, and plains. He'd heard the tales about Dead Man's Pass, the long-haul legends, the whispers of ghost convoys appearing in the fog, lights from rigs that disappeared decades ago shining through the mist. But he'd always laughed it off as just stories to spook rookie drivers. On this particular night, he had a big shipment, a load of timber from northern Idaho to Salt Lake City, and the company had put him on a tight schedule. A snowstorm was blowing in, and the dispatcher had warned him to keep ahead of it. He figured he could make it through the pass before the worst of the weather hit. As JT climbed higher into the mountains, the snow thickened, transforming the road into a slick white ribbon twisting through towering trees. The radio stations had all faded to static, leaving him in silence with only the whistling wind and the rumbling engine to keep him company. He was about halfway through the pass when he first noticed the lights. At first, it was just a single pair of headlights in his rearview mirror, faint and flickering through the snow. JT thought it might be another trucker, but something about the lights felt off. They didn't shine the way they should, too dim and hazy, almost like lanterns in a fog. He squinted, adjusting his mirror to get a better look, but every time he glanced back, the lights seemed to disappear, only to reappear moments later, a little closer each time. Feeling a chill creep up his spine, JT decided to speed up, hoping to put some distance between himself and whatever was behind him. But as he rounded a bend, he saw another set of lights ahead of him, glowing faintly through the storm. They were low and steady, moving slowly, almost like they were waiting for him. JT felt his heart start to pound. He hadn't passed anyone for miles, and there shouldn't have been any trucks ahead of him on the road. Keeping his eyes on the eerie lights, he gripped the wheel tightly, his fingers going numb from the cold seeping into the cab. As he got closer, he noticed more details. The rig ahead of him was old, its taillights small and round, like something out of the 1950s. The paint was faded and rusted, and he could make out the faint outline of a name scrawled on the side. Stewart Freight Lines. He'd never heard of the company before, and he'd driven through these mountains hundreds of times. Just as he was about to switch lanes and pass the truck, a voice crackled over his CB radio, cutting through the static with a shrill, distorted hum. "Convoy 17, calling Convoy 17, report your position." The voice was tinny and distant, like it was coming from another time. JT felt a shiver run through him as he reached for the CB mic, hesitating before responding. This is JT Turner. I'm, alone out here on Dead Man's Pass," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Silence. The radio hissed with static, and he was about to put the mic down when the voice came through again, louder this time, and filled with a desperate, almost pleading tone. "Convoy 17, this is dispatch. You're off course." "Do you copy? You're off course." JT blinked, staring at the radio in disbelief. There was no way this was real. It had to be some kind of prank, or maybe an old radio signal bouncing around the mountains. But something about the voice made his blood run cold. Ahead of him, the old truck was still crawling along, and JT felt an overwhelming urge to get around it, to get away from whatever strange convoy this was. He flicked his blinker and started to pass, but as he pulled up alongside the rig, he caught a glimpse of the driver. The man was sitting rigidly behind the wheel, staring straight ahead, his face pale and expressionless. He was wearing an old-fashioned trucker's cap, and his clothes looked worn and faded, as though they'd been through decades of hard use. But it was his eyes that unsettled JT the most. Empty, hollow, as if the man behind them was long gone. JT slammed on the gas, pulling ahead of the ghostly truck as quickly as he could. But as he glanced in his side mirror, he saw the convoy growing. More trucks appeared behind him, their headlights dim and foggy, their bodies old and rusted, each one bearing the same faded logo: Stewart Freight Lines. Panic set in as the CB crackled again, the voice sounding more frantic, more distorted, each word overlapping with a static-laden hum. "Convoy 17, do you read?" "Convoy 17, turn back. Turn back. You're lost." JT's knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel, his mind racing. He tried to ignore the voice, tried to focus on the road ahead, but every time he looked in the mirror, the convoy was closer, the headlights glowing like ghostly eyes in the night. The snow had picked up, turning into a blinding blizzard, and JT could barely see a few feet in front of him. Suddenly, his headlights illuminated a sharp turn, the road winding precariously along the edge of a cliff. His heart pounded as he realized he was going too fast. He jammed on the brakes, feeling his rig slide, tires skidding on the icy road as he fought to keep control. The CB crackled one last time, the voice filled with an eerie calm. "Welcome to the convoy, driver. We've been waiting for you." At that moment, JT's headlights picked up a sign on the side of the road. His blood ran cold as he read the faded words: Stewart Freight Lines Memorial Highway, dedicated to the 17 truckers lost in 1953. Realization dawned, and fear unlike anything he'd ever felt gripped him. The convoy wasn't just a ghostly caravan. It was the lost souls of the truckers who had died on this very stretch of road, forever doomed to wander Dead Man's Pass, searching for a way home. With a final scream, JT yanked the wheel to the right, his truck skidding toward the edge of the road. The rig teetered for a moment, balancing on the edge before tipping back onto the road, just as the snow cleared, revealing a lone trucker coming toward him in the opposite lane. JT didn't remember the rest of the drive. All he knew was that he had somehow escaped the convoy. The next thing he remembered was pulling into a truck stop, his hands shaking, his mind reeling from what he'd seen. He staggered out of his rig, pale and sweating, his eyes wide with fear. When he told the other truckers about what he'd seen, they listened with solemn expressions, some nodding in quiet agreement. He wasn't the first to encounter the convoy, and he wouldn't be the last. They say that on cold, snowy nights in the Rockies, when the fog rolls in and the radio starts to crackle with distant voices, you might just find yourself driving in the middle of an eerie convoy, a convoy of lost souls, bound to the road, forever seeking their way out of Dead Man's Pass. And if you're not careful, if you make one wrong turn, you might just find yourself joining them. Russell Kane was a trucker who prided himself on his independence and on never needing help from anyone, no matter how long or treacherous the route. He'd driven cross-country enough times to have seen it all, or so he thought. But nothing could prepare him for what he encountered at a small, nameless truck stop in the middle of nowhere. It was late November, and he was on his way from Phoenix to St. Louis with a shipment of auto parts. The night was bitterly cold, and he had been on the road for nearly 10 hours without a break. His eyelids were heavy, and he was craving a hot coffee to keep himself awake through the last leg of his trip. He pulled off at a rundown truck stop on a lonely stretch of highway in New Mexico, the neon lights of the sign flickering dimly against the black sky. Russell had never seen this truck stop before. The sign had no name, just the word "stop" buzzing in faint, broken light. But he figured he could just grab a coffee and be on his way. As he got out of his truck, he noticed a strange quiet around him. No sounds from the distant highway, no chirping crickets or howling wind, only a heavy, unsettling silence. Inside, the place was as unremarkable as any other truck stop. A few rows of empty shelves, a rack of dusty magazines, and a small counter with an ancient coffee pot on it. The lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a dim yellow glow that made the whole room feel stale and lifeless. Behind the counter stood a man, tall and thin, with a face that looked almost wrong. It was something about his eyes, set just a little too far apart, and his skin, pale and waxy, as though he hadn't seen sunlight in years. "Coffee?" Russell asked, his voice echoing strangely in the empty room. The man nodded without a word, pouring a cup of thick black coffee that smelled burnt. Russell didn't care. He just wanted the caffeine. As he reached for the cup, the man's hand brushed his, and Russell felt a chill run down his spine. The man's skin was ice cold, like he'd been standing in a freezer. "How much?" Russell asked, wanting to get out as soon as possible. The man just shook his head, staring at him with an intensity that made Russell deeply uncomfortable. "No charge for those who stop here." Russell nodded slowly, trying to ignore the unease creeping over him, and turned to leave. But as he did, he noticed something strange in the reflection of the glass door. A group of people standing outside in the dark, just beyond the faint glow of the truck stop lights. He hadn't noticed them when he'd pulled in, and something about the way they stood, so still and silent, made his stomach twist. He pushed open the door and walked out, keeping his eyes on his truck, determined not to look at the strange figures lingering nearby. But as he got closer, he noticed something even more disturbing. His truck looked different. The paint was chipped and faded, as if it had aged overnight. The license plate was completely rusted, barely legible, and the tires looked worn and cracked. "What the hell?" he muttered, reaching out to touch the truck, only to pull his hand back quickly. The metal was icy cold, as though it had been sitting in the dead of winter for years. "Looking for a ride?" a voice called from behind him. Russell spun around to see one of the figures stepping into the light. It was a man, dressed in an old, stained trucker jacket and a cap pulled low over his eyes. But something about him was wrong, too. His movements stiff, unnatural, as if he hadn't moved in a long, long time. No, I've got my own rig," Russell stammered, backing away toward his truck. But the man just smiled, a grim, hollow grin that sent a chill through Russell's veins. "Not anymore, you don't," the man replied, his voice low and raspy. He pointed to Russell's truck, where a faint mist had started to swirl around the tires, creeping up along the sides like tendrils of fog. Panicking, Russell fumbled with his keys, trying to get the door open. But the lock was frozen, the key refusing to turn. The fog thickened, swirling faster, and Russell noticed that it wasn't just fog, it was shapes, shadows, faces, each one twisted and contorted in silent screams. "Let me go!" he shouted, banging on the door, but the figures were closing in, their faces pale and expressionless, eyes hollow and dark. The man in the trucker jacket was closest, his gaze fixed on Russell with a look of terrible hunger. "We all stopped here once," he whispered, stepping closer, his face inches from Russell's. "But once you stop, you never leave." With a desperate surge of strength, Russell managed to break free from the frozen lock and pulled the door open. He scrambled inside, slamming it shut just as the first figure reached out, its hand pressing against the window, leaving a smear of frost. He turned the key in the ignition, praying his truck would start. For a moment, nothing happened, and he could see the figures outside closing in, their faces twisted into hollow, lifeless grins. But then, mercifully, the engine roared to life, and Russell threw the truck into reverse, pulling away from the ghostly figures surrounding him. As he drove off, the truck stop faded into the darkness, its dim lights vanishing in the distance. His hands were shaking, his heart pounding as he sped down the empty highway, putting as much distance between himself and that cursed place as he could. When he finally reached the next town, he pulled into a busy truck stop, relieved to see other trucks and hear the familiar hum of engines and chatter of truckers. He got out, breathing deeply, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of dread. But as he glanced in his side mirror, he froze. There, faintly visible on the back of his rig, was a handprint, smeared in frost, as if someone, or something, had left it there as a reminder. And to this day, Russell never stops at truck stops he doesn't know. Because he knows that out there, on the long stretches of lonely highway, is a place where the lost gather, waiting for the next driver foolish enough to stop and join them.
Thanks for watching Horrific Stories. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more spine-tingling stories. Until next time, keep your lights on and your fears closed.